Scientists use hypotheses to explain data and then collect more data to see if the hypothesis is correct. If it's not, they tweak the hypothesis or form a new one and then collect more data to see if it fits, and so on and so on. Using science to understand the world is an iterative dance of hypothesis and data collection. Except it doesn't always work that way. Sometimes scientists collect huge troves of data without really knowing what discoveries are waiting to be made. They just collect it and hope for the best. For instance, for centuries, botanists and zoologists traveled around the world collecting specimens, animals, and plants, putting them in collections, labeling them, making genealogies to try to understand what was related to what and how it all fit together. And it wasn't until centuries later, after the discovery of DNA, that scientists were able to understand how these things really did fit together. But having those huge collections already in existence was an enormous help in that. Astronomers spent decades taking photographic plates of the sky, cataloging everything that they found without, in many cases, understanding what it was they were looking at. But then later, these plates could be used to make discoveries or to confirm discoveries that were made after the fact. Famously, when Clyde Tombaugh discovered Pluto by comparing two photographic plates that he'd taken, other astronomers rushed to look at plates that they themselves had taken and cataloged to see if they could find evidence for the new planet. And in about a dozen cases, they could. So they were able to pre-confirm the discovery. More recently, an astronomer named Michael Showalter was able to discover a new moon around Neptune by carefully examining archive photographs that had been taken by the Hubble Space Telescope the previous decade. So what does all this have to do with MH370? Well, in order to understand the debris, which is the only physical evidence we have of the mystery, we need to compare the marine life growing on the debris with data on how these organisms grow under similar conditions. To do that, we're going to need to collect specimens from buoys managed by an office of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration called the Atlantic Oceanographic and Meteorological Laboratory, or AOML. This is exactly the kind of massive data collection that botanists and astronomers did in the old days, collecting reams upon reams of data. In this case, the US government makes freely available to anyone, scientist or not, all over the world to use in their research. Mostly it's used for modeling ocean currents, which is incredibly important for climate modeling, which in turn is incredibly important for survival of our species. What we're interested in this case, MH370, isn't that old data though, but the real-time data that each buoy is collecting, so that we can try to use it to intercept these buoys to collect those barnacles, those specimens that will tell us how these things grow. With me today, I am very happy to have the program's acting deputy director, Rick Lumpkin. Probably nobody knows more than him about global drifters and what happens to them. Jeff Wise back with you for episode 17 of Finding MH370. Before we get into it with Rick Lumpkin, I'd like to invite anyone who's interested in our project to identify buoys to collect barnacles from to pitch in. I've started a chat on Substack to discuss what drifters are looking interesting, and the more eyeballs that we have on these things, the better. So there's a link in the show page and also in the YouTube description. So I would encourage anyone who wants to help out. This is a great opportunity to do that, and we'd certainly appreciate it. Also, anyone who speaks French and English and wants to help out, that would be amazing. It would be great. One of the major locations that these drifters are coming ashore are islands like Mauritius, La Réunion, Mayotte. These are places where if we can contact officials who speak French, that would be very, very useful. Madagascar too. A lot of French is spoken. Also, stick around after the interview with Rick Lumpkin. I want to talk about some super interesting developments on the hybrid warfare front that I think go a long way to explaining why it's been so hard to make sense of so many topics in recent years, and in particular MH370. And as always, if you like the show, please subscribe. If you visit the show page and hit subscribe there, you'll get a free weekly newsletter. And if you opt for a paid subscription on the Substack page, you get exclusive early access to midweek content, which at the moment is remastered episodes of season 1 of the podcast, Deep Dive MH370, where we break down the basics of the case step by step, explaining what we know and what it all means. All right, with that, let's get on with the interview with Rick Lumpkin of the AOML. Thank you so much for joining me today. You are the Deputy Director of the AOML. I was hoping you could tell our listeners a little bit about what that does. It's part of NOAA, and you are in charge of the Global Drifter, basically putting the buoys out there and collecting the data, managing the data.
Right. Yeah, that's right. So my lab, AOML, is a research laboratory of NOAA. So NOAA is divided into different parts, like the Weather Service, the part that operates ships and aircrafts, the National Ocean Service, and the fisheries, and then the research branch. NOAA Global Drifter Program has basically two main centers in the United States. One is at Scripps Institute of Oceanography. The PI there is Luca Centurioni. That group develops new drifters. They purchase most of the drifters of the global array, and they handle the real-time distribution of the data. Here at AOML, I'm the principal investigator of our part of the program. We get the data and we create delayed mode quality control data products for people to be able to study ocean circulation. The drifters also measure temperatures, so you can see how ocean temperatures have changed. And we're responsible for maintaining the global array. So we work with partners all around the world to deploy drifters in the Atlantic, Pacific, Indian Ocean, and the Southern Oceans.
And what is so really neat is that you have this massive data set that you've been collecting for decades, and it's absolutely freely available. It's right there. And not only do you maintain this excellent, huge source of data, but you make it really accessible and easy to use. It's all right up there on the web. You can see where there's a little dot where every single one is, and you can just click on it and see the data.
Yeah, no, we first of all, of course, the data is owned by the taxpayers, and we make it available to everybody, and including the international community. Like I said, a lot of our drifters are deployed by, for example, South African Bureau of Meteorology and the Australian Meteorology Bureau. They get better forecasts from the drifters in exchange for them doing the work to get them out in the water for us. So having data sharing has been something that's just grown and grown since the late 80s, when people tended to say, this is my data and you'll get it after I publish a paper, to now where you're getting the data as the same time that we're getting the data, basically. And yeah, I have a whole team of people here at AOML, led by a guy named Sean Dolk, who has taken great strides to make the data ever more available and visual and accessible.
Yeah, I've been emailing with Sean. He's been super, super helpful. So it's been really great. The thing about scientific data is that you collect it usually with some purpose in mind, but once you have a massive data, you don't know what you're going to find in it.
Right.
I just think it's really neat that you guys make it so accessible.
Yeah, and we've definitely discovered things in the data that we didn't expect to see. Some of my favorite papers came from some surprises.
Right. So the viewers and listeners of my podcast, we've already talked to Andy Sabrandi at Pacific Gyre. We have talked to, I think you might have seen the episode where we went chasing by remote control, as it were, along the Kenyan coast, trying to grab this drifter. So people know why we're interested in this data and how we're interested in kind of using it to backstop the data that was the barnacles essentially that were on the flap run. Have people used I mean, I should of course sort of parenthetically say that what we're sort of aiming to use your data in part to locate where drifters are now so that we can get more data from them in the form of Lepas shells. Have people used global drifter buoys for the purposes of investigating biofouling organisms?
I'm not aware of a lot of efforts for that. There have been a few people who are interested in sampling biofouling on drifters that had been in the water for quite a while, but often for things like testing anti-biofouling or just to see what species grow where. and nothing that I'm aware of that's specifically what you're talking about doing with the drifters in the Indian Ocean to see, how quickly particular species grew, given travel times and such that we know very well from the drifters. It's a really niche application that we just hadn't really thought about compared to more common uses like just the general pathways in the ocean to see does it make sense that if a plane crashed here that the debris would end up here, which is kind of a more typical use of the data.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's basically three major questions that I think we can try to shed a light on with regards to organisms growing on floating debris. And I should say that this is a pretty niche application, but it's not one that people hadn't already been thinking about. There was a paper out of Italy that
Mm-hmm.
was published just a few months before MH370 disappeared, where they looked at Lepas growing on a human corpse, actually, that was found floating near Italy. And the
Mm-hmm.
question was, well, can we learn something about how long this body's been in the water based on the Lepas? One of the things that the data is still very patchy. Which is why I think this work still needs to be done. If there was a substantial body
Mm-hmm.
of Lepas anatifera shells collected from drifters of known passage through the oceans and temperature and all that, it could be a really useful calibration device because barnacles do seem to grow differently depending on the temperature, the particular ocean or part of the ocean that they go through. Very famously, when the tsunami debris went into the ocean after the famous Japanese tsunami, the
Right.
stuff that drifted across the ocean through the northern Pacific, which is very rich, had much more elaborate marine life growing on it than the stuff that went closer to Hawaii, which is less dense in terms of
Mm-hmm.
nutrients. So it's kind of an exciting project. It's been an interesting kind of adventure almost in trying to track some of these things down. I think it was Andy Sabrandi who gave me the data set of one of his drifters that wound up coming ashore on Madagascar, and he watched it being carried across the island and wound up at this fisheries institute.
Mm-hmm.
I contacted them. It was not easy. Nothing in Madagascar is easy. But when I contacted the guy, he seemed pretty offended that I was asking him about his buoy. And I sort of felt bad because when I looked at the data, actually it looked like it wasn't really at his institute. It was like in the yard south of his
Oh,
institute. So
okay.
I kind of believed him that he didn't have it. But then you emailed me just the other day and you said, actually, this is very common in your experience.
We had this happen in the Florida Keys just a few years ago where we saw it was in somebody's backyard and knocked on the door and he insisted left, right, and center that he didn't have it, didn't know anything about what we were talking about. And, finally we just had to say, okay, we're going to drop it. We're not going to push this. He was getting angry. So we said, okay, let's de-escalate this. But yeah, it can be frustrating.
What did I mean? I guess we can only speculate on what he wanted
Right.
with it. He probably thought that it was like government property, and you were going to accuse him of like a federal felony or something. Or who knows, really?
It's quite possible. Yeah, we tried to explain that we were just wanting to get it to put it back in the water again because it was still working. But yeah, I think there's a paranoia among some communities in the Keys about NOAA because of fisheries
Mm.
regulations and laws being enforced, including punishment actions against people who are violating fisheries limits and periods and such. And so I think that kind of probably tied in to that particular experience. But I've had experiences in the past too with boaters regularly picking them up just because they thought they were a cool thing to collect basically.
But it doesn't. I mean, I guess I'm a little bit surprised to hear that because it just seems like a buoy. I mean, there's like 100 buoys in any given harbor that look kind of the same. I mean, sometimes it has like antenna sticking up, but
Yeah, I agree. I don't know. They're designed to be pretty low profile, to be kind of hard to see unless you're right on them. So it is surprising to me that as many get picked up as are. And it's not a huge number, but it's something like on the order of 10 to 20 a year get picked up. Maybe more get picked up that have deactivated, so we don't see that. But it's very clear. You see the ones that suddenly go shooting across. It's at 10 knots to a nearby port. You know that it's not following an ocean current.
Well, since we got interested in this project, me and Keely and some other folks are helping out. We started paying attention, and all of a sudden we started seeing these things coming aground. One just came ashore in the Comoros. One just it stopped in the water off the coast of Brazil, and then, like as you say, shot into a port in Brazil. And I feel, based on our Kenyan experience, boy, it didn't take long for someone to like clear that gunk off. People
Yeah.
don't like that. The stuff that we value the most is people don't want it. So it's frustrating. But have you? I guess a couple of things I wanted to just sort of ask you point blank. I kind of got the impression that you don't mind us doing this. To sort of say it overtly, our goal is to kind of try to either catch these things when they've just come ashore or else
Mhm.
intercept them while they're still floating. We don't want to interfere with them, but we do want to take off like a dozen barnacles and kind of photograph it before putting it back. Are you okay with that?
Yeah, as long as it was done carefully. There these you can find out from our web page whether or not the sea anchor, the drogue, is still attached. If
Right.
it's not, it would be very easy to be able to pull that float out of the water, sample it, and put it back in the water again. It would require a little more delicate approach if the drogue is still attached, because the drogue is about 10 meters long, centered at a depth of 15 meters, with a very long cable. And so, there's the potential for a lot of drag, the potential for damaging the tether if you kinked it as you were taking something up onto the boat. So it just would require probably having another conversation with Andy about how to do that for a drogued drifter without
Right.
damaging it. But for an undrogued drifter, which a lot of them are, the drogue tends to fall off after maybe 300 days in the water. For those,
Okay.
it would be a very, very easy operation.
I also wanted to ask you, Rick, about advice. To what extent do you guys ever go trying to find these things and pick them? And do you ever like go to try to pick them up?
Almost never, because the cost of a drifter is on the order of $2,000 each, whereas a day at sea on a ship is tens of thousands of dollars, and so it's just not usually an economical thing to go out and recover them and for the purpose of maybe redeploying or something along those lines. When they
Right.
do wash ashore and we find out about it, we generally advise people, if it's still transmitting, to just put it back in the water. If it
Right.
hasn't, if it stops transmitting, it's usually we just advise that they dispose of it like they would any buoy they find. These drifters have D-cell alkaline batteries, so no lithium batteries or anything that's like a hazardous material or anything like that.
And they last for quite a while in the ocean. They can last for years.
That's right. Yeah, especially in really cold waters, because those D cell batteries can last a really long time in cold water. So we've had a drifter circle the world in the Antarctic circumpolar current, more than twice, circumnavigating the entire planet.
Wow. You know, when you start playing around with the interface that you guys maintain, it's kind of addictive because you can really find out the story of each of these things. And before I just started poking around in it, I sort of had this idea. When you look at a kid's geography textbook and it has like the lines of the current, you sort of have this rather deterministic idea of like it's kind of going to goes around and around. But it's not. I mean, you click on these things and you see these really kind of random walk types of paths that they take. And especially if you're hoping that one of them comes ashore so you can try to go grab it,
Yeah,
it's like frustrating because nothing goes in, from here to there.
yeah. The ocean is filled with whirls and eddies and swirls, and so yeah, you have to average over lots and lots and lots of those kinds of trajectories before you start seeing a lot of the kind of the currents that we map out. Even really strong currents like the Gulf Stream, you will sometimes see a drifter that is where that very strong current normally is, going in exactly the opposite direction because of a meander of the current, or because it's pinching off a ring or eddy or something like that. So yeah, it is wild to see how much of that kind of turbulence you have across all the scales that you can resolve, even down to the hour by hour changes that the drifters are showing.
Yeah. This was of burning interest to me as this drifter was getting closer and closer to the Kenyan shore. We were really struggling with the fact that the data that's available on the website is like 4 hours old.
Hmm.
And so, if you're going to come ashore, and 4 hours is a long time when something is sitting on the coastline.
Yeah.
There's animals, there's people, and I don't know. Is there any way to get more current data?
That the main lag in the system there is the satellites that it's talking to are the Iridium network. So there's almost always one directly over, or not directly overhead, but there's one that the drifter can communicate to when it sends its on the hour transmission. Then that satellite ends up having to go over a relay station where it's going to send the data down, and then that gets transmitted to us to Scripps, and it's distributed from there onto the those servers that we have. So the two real sources of kind of delay in the system are the time it takes for that satellite to get to a ground relay station, and then usually the time for the data servers. Usually those aren't updated, but maybe once an hour as well, or maybe even at a longer schedule. So those are the main things kind of impeding even faster than like 4 hours or something like that.
So you can't like put it into like urgent mode where it's going to tell you where it is every hour or even less.
We can, and where we've done that in the past was for people deploying drifters as part of a research cruise when they really needed to find out what the ocean was doing around the ship. So it's not a standard operating procedure, but we can, for specific drifters, we can at least bypass the second of those two delays.
Okay. So if we were to get a boat to go try to intercept a drifter, would it be possible to maybe come to you and say, listen, we're trying to intercept this particular one. Can you provide us with more current data? Is that something that might be able to happen?
Yeah, as long as we had some heads up, at least like a week to be able to set up what, which is a sort of a typical lead time,
A
or
week.
at least 72 hours before a hurricane deployment. We're getting everything set up and ready so that the data can be pushed right away. So with a little bit of lead time, yes, we could do that.
Okay. Okay. I'm not 100% sure that's possible because of how random these things are, but I'll tell you what, there was one that was just shooting down the coast of Madagascar, and Madagascar is one of the hardest places to do anything.
Hmm.
I've been there. It's like it's just really hard to like get anything organized. It's kind of a sparsely populated remote stretch of coast. There's a town at the sort of southeastern tip, and we contacted somebody who does some business there, and they're like, look, there are no like recreational boats here. It's all like mining,
Hmm.
sea going vessels and stuff. Anyway, we're learning a lot, but we're sort of putting together an informal network of people who can maybe sort of try to reach out and grab stuff. It's interesting. Do you think that this global drifter program will go forever, or is it like will you sort of map the currents in such detail that like you don't need to keep doing it?
Um, it's a good question. It's a very inexpensive way of measuring things in situ that we need one way or another to be measuring actually in the water to be able to calibrate satellites. So, for example, the temperatures. 70% of the Earth's surface is ocean, and while satellites can infer surface temperature from infrared and microwave measurements, things like aerosols in the atmosphere can contaminate those measurements. And so you really want things in the water measuring. You also really need the barometers for surface pressure on those drifters, which significantly improve weather forecasts. Especially, there have been studies that show if you deny the data, rapid cyclogenesis events can be completely missed in a forecast. And so that's like, really extreme conditions that can endanger mariners' lives. So we do need a solution to get those kinds of measurements. At least for the time being. Maybe in the future there'll be satellites that are not prone to that kind of contamination, which would sort of eliminate the need for that mission. Maybe uh, some other way of measuring or deducing surface pressure can be derived. But for now, surface drifters really are the most economical way of being able to get these kinds of measurements.
It's all part of, I think, a really interesting trend, which is robotics and automation together with satellite telemetry is creating more and more ways to find out more and more information about really remote and otherwise hard to reach parts of the globe.
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely agree. And things are changing pretty quickly. It feels like in this field.
Yeah, Rick, I want to thank you so much. You've been incredibly helpful. I think that's all I had to ask you today. I really look forward to working with you on this, and sort of sharing with you what we find, and maybe you guys can help us, like, give us ideas about how to find these things. I feel like it's kind of an art as well as a science of, like, using the satellite data to figure out where these things are, but then sort of use human intuition and
Hmm.
context to try to figure out a way to do that last little bit, which is to actually get the barnacles in your boat.
Yeah,
Um, and you certainly have a lot of savvy. You've been doing this for a long time, and you're super knowledgeable. So
thank you. It was my
I,
pleasure.
so just to repeat, the data that we're getting from AOML and using to locate buoys that we hope to extract Lepas barnacles from, it's going to be an ongoing project. Keely and I would love to have help from anyone who feels like giving it. Again, we'll be discussing this on the Substack chat. The link is in the show page and in the notes here on YouTube. In the episodes to come, we'll be focusing on other aspects of the MH370 mystery, but I will be keeping up to date on this project in the community radar segments. Speaking of which, there is a topic that I'd like to address in a special segment right now about the information environment. In previous episodes, we've talked about Russia's hybrid warfare against the West, which has included shooting down another Malaysian airliner and numerous acts of sabotage, subterfuge, and hacking. These things are all connected, and in many cases, they are carried out by the same agencies. One of the maddening things about hybrid warfare is that, as we saw in episode 14, your enemy is constantly trying to confuse you, get inside your OODA loop, prevent you from forming a clear picture of what your situation is and what's happening to you. As we said in that episode, if you're badly confused about what's going on, you might have an enemy inside your OODA loop. In the case of Russia's current gray zone warfare against the West, one of its main targets is our information economy, the structure by which we collectively gather and process information. That includes both social media and mainstream press. When it's done successfully, it can so confuse the enemy that its own role is obscured. It can attack without even being seen to attack. This played out in 2016 when the GRU, aka Russian Military Intelligence, hacked into the servers of the Democratic National Committee and released emails to the media, fueling a firestorm of negative publicity that boosted Donald Trump's campaign and ultimately put him in the White House. After Trump took office, the FBI director, James Comey, announced a criminal investigation into whether Trump's advisors had colluded with the Russian government to basically help him steal the election. And Trump fired Comey and quashed the investigation. This led to the appointment of a special counsel to investigate obstruction of justice, as well as charges of Russian collusion. Trump appointed William Barr as his attorney general to rein in the investigation, eventually got it all squashed, suppressed, and the right-wing media went on an offensive to declare the whole Russia thing, quote unquote, a hoax. For instance, here's a 2020 video of a right-wing YouTuber named Tim Pool with the title, "Trump Drops Massive Bombshell Implicating Hillary Clinton, Democrats in Fabricating Russiagate Hoax."
To this day, Democrats insist that Donald Trump is still colluding with the Russians and that the Russians are interfering in our election to once again help Donald Trump win. That was one of the main arguments they made in 2016 and following. We endured years of the Russiagate investigation where they claimed Donald Trump colluded with Russia with foreign help to steal the election from Hillary Clinton. They launched an investigation, the Mueller probe. They didn't find evidence of any collusion. And as we now know, evidence keeps piling up that this whole thing was a hoax. We also have evidence to suggest Joe Biden himself was helping stage this hoax to sabotage the incoming administration after Donald Trump actually won.
To a remarkable extent, the mainstream media played along, and despite all the facts to the contrary, many Americans accept as conventional wisdom the idea that charges of Russian interference in the 2016 election were just a conspiracy theory. The mainstream media to this day remains quite uncomfortable with the idea that Russia helped install Trump in the White House, and that Trump's constant fawning over Putin and cheerleading for Russia has to be seen in that context. But maybe that tide is changing. Here is David Korn writing in Mother Jones. This is the third American presidential election in a row in which Putin has waged covert information warfare against the United States to help Trump. In 2016, he ordered a hack and leak operation and a clandestine social media campaign to hinder Hillary Clinton and boost Trump. 4 years later, Ukraine officials tied to Russian intelligence spread disinformation designed to smear Joe Biden. Korn was writing in the wake of news that the U.S. Justice Department was cracking down on Russian efforts to interfere in the election. Korn writes that, among other things, the DOJ, quote, indicted 2 employees of RT, the Russian state-controlled media operation, for allegedly secretly funneling $10 million to an American right-wing media outfit. Tenant Media, an operation created last year, features the work of right-wing and libertarian firebrands such as Tim Pool. Tim Pool. In other words, Russia was paying people to say that Russiagate was a hoax, just a conspiracy theory, and that messaging worked. There was a conspiracy to convince the public that a real conspiracy was just a crazy conspiracy theory. Now, I might be a little sensitive because I've been on the receiving end a lot of this kind of talk, and it can be very frustrating. But as I said, maybe the wheel is turning. All right, I think that's a good place to stop. I will leave it at that for this week. Once again, if you like the podcast, please hit like or subscribe. And as I always say, don't stop looking and don't stop asking hard questions. See you later.